Uh, do you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to start my lecture, which is literary criticism and theory. Uh, Before starting the lecture, let me clarify the planning of this semester, that what we are going to cover in this semester. As the title suggests, that this course is literary criticism and theory. So I will take start with the uh, title, understanding about the title, clarifying the difference between theory and criticism, and then I will move into the area of traditional criticism, which is liberal humanism or liberalism. After that, when I pave the ground for the critical literary theory, I will take start with the formalism and structuralism, and from structuralism, I would then lead into narratology, a branch of structuralism, and which is also a critical approach and the most important approach. Even that narratology is a full-fledged area in itself. Then I will try to explain post-structuralism, especially with reference to Derrida's um, understanding of deconstruction, the technique of deconstruction. This would be the background for literary theories. Without understanding these concepts, I think it is not possible to have clear understanding of the literary theory as a critical approach. So this would be the background, and then we will move on into some of few literary theories. I will try to explain them in detail. So this is the future plan. So let's start with the word theory, and I will differentiate it from the word criticism. What is literary theory? Theory is, and it can help us learn to see ourselves and our world in valuable new ways, ways that can influence how we educate our children, both as parents and teachers. Literary theory, it is a sort of lens, the way you look at different things through a particular lens that gives you an access to have a clear vision of something. So this theory, it is also a sort of lens. It is a sort of direction. It gives you direction to have a look at and to have a vision of something. And let me give you some example. For example, if we want to look at the status of women uh, through the lens of feminist criticism, so that gives you a clear understanding of the status of women. The status of women in the past, when women was considered as passive, and the status of women in the recent times, whether that recent modernism, that is not the recent time, rather postmodernism, that is the most recent time. So her status in the postmodernism. Now there is a clear difference between the status of women in the past and the status of women in the postmodern scenario. So when you look at the status of women through the lens of post-feminism, that gives you a different understanding. You look at the status of the colonizer and the colonized, their relationship. So traditionally, the kind of understanding which was developed through colonial discourses, and a sort of relationship was built up between the colonizer and the colonized, which was exactly the relationship of the master and slave. Now that is one thing, but looking at their status through the perspective of, or through the lens of post-colonial theory, that gives you a different understanding. So this theory, it can help us to see ourselves and our world in valuable new ways. When we want to look at ourselves and the way we are connected with this world through different ways, whether we are connected, man is connected with women, or man is connected with the elite class, or man is connected with the colonizer, or man is connected with the imperial powers, or man is connected with the natural background, which we study through the lens of eco-criticism. Our man is connected with culture, which we study through the lens of cultural materialism. These are different ways. which we use in order to have a look at the different aspects of ourselves and our relationship with the world. And when we look at the man and woman, or when we look at ourselves to different ways, so that gives us a new understanding, that gives us a new meaning. Whether that new meaning we derive in the form of, for example, deconstruction, that we expose the hidden meanings, we try to unearth the hidden meanings. There was traditionally an approach which was called practical criticism. And later on, I will discuss that practical criticism, which was promoted by I.A. Richards, which was of the view that uh, in order to appreciate a literary text, we need to focus on the words on the page. Only words on the page, they are enough. So that was rejected. And it was rejected by these literary approaches. So ways that can influence how we educate our children, both as parents and teachers. In academic situation, we are more concerned with the relationship of the teachers and the students. So in an academic situation, teachers, they develop new meanings, they derive new meanings by applying critical theories. And it is not necessarily restricted to academic situation. Rather, in our daily life, we can make use of these new lenses in order to have a new meaning of the life, of the various aspects of life. So this is one understanding of theory. That what do we mean by theory? Think of each theory as a new pair of eyeglasses through which certain elements of our world are brought into focus, while others, of course, fade into the background. When we look at, for example, the relationship of the elite class and the poor class, the way the elite class, they try to exploit the lower class, the working class, that we studied through the lens of Marxist criticism. So that is a sort of eyeglasses. We look at the relationship, the way there is a base structure and there is a superstructure, and the relationship is built up, that is developed, and a building of a building is erected, in which at the top we find the elite class and at the base we find the working class, the poor class. How that relationship is naturalized, for which ideology is used, and this relationship is maintained very smoothly. There is no disturbance in the relationship, or disturbance doesn't seem to be part of that relationship. So uh, it is a sort of eyeglasses through which certain elements of our world are brought into focus. Now, when we look at the relationship, there are many aspects which move into the background. We look at the things which are more important or which gain importance. For example, in case of feminism or feminist criticism, the relationship of man and woman through the new lens that comes into the foreground, and the traditional understanding of their relationship that moves into the background. And this foregrounding and backgrounding, these are important terms which we will discuss later on. When we interpret a literary text, we are doing literary criticism. So it means that criticism, it is actually the application of literary theory. Literary theory is something very general, and it is a sort of general area which gives us some inspiration and guidance in order to have a proper understanding and a very clear understanding of a particular text. So literary is something that is too much general, that gives us dictation, that gives us guidance, and out of that guidance, then we try to interpret a particular text, whether it is a Shakespearean play, or it is the novel of Kim, or it is the novel of Jane Austen, or it is any other literary text. So when we come to a particular text, and the way, for example, S.E. Bradley, he developed a critique of the Shakespearean plays, the most prominent critic of Shakespearean plays. Now, he focused only on the plays of Shakespeare. So that is literary criticism, which is actually the interpretation of a literary text. And this is the difference between literary theory and literary criticism. So once again, I tell you that literary theory, it is general, and literary criticism, it is focused. Literary theory, it is not about an individual text, and literary criticism, that is about a particular text. When we examine the criteria upon which our interpretation rests, we are doing critical theory. There are certain rules and certain regulations, and literary theory that is guided and that is influenced with those rules and regulations. For example, feminist criticism, it has its own framework. And then just feminist criticism, it is not enough. Rather, there is feminist criticism of the first world, of the second world, of the third world. And there is feminist criticism, it has its own layers, are its own waves: first wave, second wave, third wave, so that we can specify even further. But it has its own rules. In the same way, post-colonial theory, it has its own rules. Eco-criticism, it has its own rules and its own framework. So simply put, literary criticism is the application of critical theory. As I have already said, that criticism, when we apply those rules on a particular text, that becomes literary criticism. Whether or not a given critic is aware of the theoretical assumptions informing her or his interpretation, whether it is not necessarily a conscious effort, even if it might be unconscious effort developing a theory, especially when it is in the initial stage of its development. So those views and those principles and those rules and regulations, they work. Theory means writing about literature in general, not about individual works or writers. Criticism is about individual works or writers, the way S.E. Bradley, he developed his views about Shakespeare and about his plays. So that is literary criticism. And theory, it is too much general. It is not about a particular text or about a particular literary text. Literary criticism tries to explain the literary work to us. With the help of literary criticism, we actually try to develop meaning. We try to develop a clear understanding of that text. Uh, the question is that why do we need literary criticism? Do we need literary criticism in order to appreciate a literary text? So literary criticism, it actually helps us in developing a more refined understanding of that text, though it is not compulsory part of the aesthetic pleasure. Without criticism, we can have that aesthetic pleasure by reading that literary text. But in order to have a refined understanding of the literary text, we need criticism. And how does this criticism help us in order to develop a more refined understanding of the text? That we will discuss later on, when we will be doing the practical activity in the form of criticism, when we will try to criticize a text, so that we can look for the hidden meanings, for the unexplored meanings, or for those meanings which do not seem to be very clear on superficial reading. In fact, the widespread recognition that literary criticism cannot be separated from the theoretical assumptions on which it is based is one reason why the word criticism is often used as if it included the word theory. Criticism and theory, these are interconnected. Without general rules and without general framework, we cannot criticize a text. So we must have that general framework, and after getting inspiration and guidance from that framework, we can have a proper criticism of a proper text. So these are interconnected. The way Derrida, he developed his own technique, which is called deconstructive theory of language. Now that deconstructive technique, that is inspired with post-structuralist views of Jacques Derrida. And that deconstructive technique, or that deconstruction, that is the applied form of post-structuralism. That is the practical form of post-structuralism. Later on, we will discuss what is meant by post-structuralism. And examples of literary criticism would include a deconstructive interpretation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or a Marxist analysis of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. You take a text, you apply the views and concepts of that literary critical approach, so that will give you literary criticism. This is about the difference between theory and criticism. Now I will move back to.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Sir, I have a question. So, can we say that deconstruction is a theory, and if we apply this theory on a certain text, like there is a poem, White Sargasso Sea, so that is literary criticism. Can we say that?
White Sargasso Sea is not a poem. That is a novel written by
A
Jane
novel,
Hess.
actually, it's a yes, sir. Yes. Yes, it's a novel.
So it's a novel, and first you need to understand what is meant by post-structuralism. I will discuss post-structuralism later on. Before that, I will discuss structuralism. But before structuralism, I will discuss the rise of English literature, the background of English literature. Then that would be followed by the liberal humanism, and then structuralism, and then post-structuralism. But at this stage, I just want to clarify your confusion very briefly, that post-structuralism, that is about language. I would say confusion created out of language, and that confusion is based on the lack of stability in language. You have to assume that language gives us reality. Reality is the product of language. And because both in structuralism and post-structuralism, that language, that is the central point, that is the point of investigation, especially for Jacques Derrida. So when you assume that language gives reality, reality is a constructed product of language, then one step, if you go ahead, you have to assume that this product, this reality, it is not stable. Rather, it is it just moves from one place to another place. It is we can say fluid, the way fluid that doesn't have a proper shape. In the same way, this constructed reality of language, it doesn't have a proper shape, it changes on. So we can say that language, it is something which cannot be controlled. It is not in our control. We cannot control language. Therefore, then further you have to assume that there is no stable reality. Rather, reality or truth that is restricted just to different societies and different communities, and it keeps on changing from one place to another place. Now, that would be a simple understanding of deconstruction or post-structuralism. Further, we have to investigate that what is the problem, which we link that problem with the language, and out of that language, what kind of confusion that we see. That we'll discuss later on. Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let me share another slide that is about the rise of English literature. Do you see the new slide? That is the history of English studies.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. What is the reason that I want to talk about the history of English studies? It will help us in the understanding of liberal humanism, which is the next topic that I will discuss and that I will try to explain. In order to understand liberal humanism or liberalism, which is a traditional approach for understanding a text, it is necessary to have a clear understanding of the history of English studies or the rise of English studies. Now, the English that we see in the present scenario, in the form of full-fledged subject, in the form of full-fledged department. Okay, so this English study, or this area, it was not exactly in the same form in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century. At that time, English study, it was quite restricted, especially to it was restricted to a particular class, just to that class which was religious minded, and it was not taught as a proper subject in the form of language, in the form of literature. It was taught just for the religious purpose. For example, uh, the higher education was like in England until the first quarter of the 19th century. And at that time, only mathematics, Latin and Greek literatures, and the divinity, these were the subjects which were taught in Oxford and Cambridge universities, and even before that, in the chapels of Oxford and Cambridge. And moreover, there was a restriction, like all the students, they were not allowed to get education. There was a particular class, because this education, it was in complete control of the Church of England. It was their monopoly that they enjoyed, and they created their own principles, and they created their own instructions for giving admission to the people. For example, women, they were not allowed to get admission in the colleges or in those chapels. It was restricted only for men. Secondly, at that time, there was no full-fledged department of English. I'm talking about the 1820s and 1830s. At that time, there was no full-fledged subject of English. There were debates uh, at the acceptability of English as a proper subject. And let me tell you that in 1832, this English was already introduced in the Indian subcontinent. I'm quoting it from the book of Hans Burden, where it is clearly mentioned that English as a proper course, it was already introduced in the Indian subcontinent. There is also an essay on the introduction of English literature into the Indian subcontinent, and that essay is written by Gauri Vishwanathan. That will, if you read that essay, that will give you a clear picture of how English was introduced in Indian subcontinent into our curriculum, and what was the political motive behind that. But the same situation that happened before that in England. So let me tell you that at that time it was in complete control of the Church of England. It was in their control, and they had to decide what was to be taught and what was not to be taught, and who were the people who were to be taught. So anyone who was Catholic or Jewish or atheist, he or she was not allowed to take admission in these institutions, or in these chapels, or in these colleges. That was because of the religious restrictions. Okay, then from 1828, English was offered as a subject for study, and they appointed the first professor of English in 1829. Now, when English was offered till 1825, this English was not seen as a proper course. It was not seen as a full-fledged area. But after 1826, we can see this change, especially when in 1828, the English professor was appointed. And then after that, English language that was introduced, because there were technical problems and there were technical issues. For example, there were objections on English literature as a proper course. And let me quote a professor that was a professor of history, and his name was Edward Freeman. When he shared his views about English literature, so he was not in favor of English literature and he raised an objection. And what was his objection? Let me quote his objection. Let me quote his exact words. He said, "We are told that the study of literature cultivates the taste, educates the sympathies, and enlarges the mind. These are all excellent things, only we cannot examine taste and sympathies. Examiners must have technical and positive information to examine." Now, Edward Freeman, he was not in favor of English literature as a proper course in Oxford or Cambridge University, because he was of the view that it was not possible to examine English literature like mathematics, like physics, like chemistry, because literature was something which was highly subjective. So, till this stage, English was accepted only in the form of language. And this is the reason that English, even now, it has been linked and it has been connected with the study of language through historical perspective, that English has to be studied in the form of, for example, medieval English and then Middle English and then modern English. So only that extent of English that was accepted. Anyhow, I'm just talking about the journey of English as a proper subject, the way it was introduced in Cambridge and Oxford University. In 1840, F.D. Morris, he was the professor who was appointed at King's College, and this King's College, it was the college which was in London, and later on it became London University. So he said about English literature, he said that through English literature, we would be able to develop principles of liberal humanism. The study of English literature would serve to emancipate us from the notions and habits which are peculiar to our own age. He was actually of the view that they needed to develop a framework which would remain the same for all the people of all the ages. If you are getting my point, I refer to literature as universal. When we say that literature is universal, it's history that we can find in the views of this F.D. Morris, who said that they needed to develop a sort of literature which would remain same for all the people and for all the ages. And this is the reason that about English literature, we have been taught and we have been inculcated that English literature, it is universal. For example, Shakespearean plays are universal, or there are certain writers who are universal. And by universal, we mean that they are the writers who have got a unique place. And this we can also find this notion of universality. This we can find in the views of Matthew Arnold, especially his book of Culture and Anarchy, who said that culture is something which is the best and which has not yet been taught. So Matthew Arnold, he was also of the view that there is a culture which is the most supreme, which is universal, and which should be the same for all the people of all the ages. But there are some points of observations and objections. For example, just one point of objection, that by culture, what do we mean? That a culture of the English society, or a culture of the Indian society, or a culture of the African society, which culture Matthew Arnold referred to? Definitely, he was part of the English society, so he referred only to English culture. And when he referred to literature, so he referred only to English literature. By English literature and by English culture, he meant the best that has been taught and said in the world. Okay, so coming again to the views of F.D. Morris. Again, I'm telling you that I'm talking about the journey of English studies, the way it was accepted in Cambridge and Oxford universities, the way it was criticized, and finally it was accepted as a proper course in those universities. So F.D. Morris in 1840, he said that he wanted to develop the principles of liberal humanism. And by liberal humanism, I mean something which remains the same for all the time, for all the people, which doesn't change. And simply, I would use the word universality. By liberal humanism, F.D. Morris meant universal literature. Okay, Morris regarded literature as the peculiar property of the middle class and the expression of their values. Now, it was the time when there was a disturbance in England, and they felt that there was inequality between the elite class and the working class. This is quite interesting that literature, it was also the time when science was promoting. And when science promoted, so it marginalized religion, Christianity, which was criticized to the peak, especially after the French Revolution in 1798, when Christianity that was no more accepted and that was no more welcomed. So religion had already lost its grip over its followers, and that had been replaced with science. Now, science needed rationalism, science needed reason, science needed something which would be based on
Logic.
empirical evidence. Now, at this stage, Matthew Arnold and people, like-minded people of Matthew Arnold, they suggested literature that could take place of Christianity or any other religion. That, in simple words, I can say that literature is the most acceptable substitute of religion, because it has all those points of inspiration. And if you read the essay of Gauri Vishwanathan, which is about the introduction of English literature into the Indian subcontinent, that also talks about the religious aspect of this English literature. Because Matthew Arnold, he said that if Christianity cannot be imposed in the Indian subcontinent, at least English literature that can be imposed on its followers. And it was done, and they were highly successful, and they are highly successful even now. We cannot get rid of English literature the way it has deeply penetrated in the form of English language, in the form of English literature, where it was possible, for example, in the African context, where it was possible to impose their Christianity. So they imposed their Christianity, for example, in African society. If you read the novel Things Fall Apart of Chinua Achebe, that will give you a clear picture of how Christianity was imposed on those people. Because in that case, in that context, it was very easy for the British colonizers. But in the Indian subcontinent, it was not easy to have a fight between Christianity and Islam. So they thought about English literature. Anyhow, this is a different topic, but I'm just linking it with the journey of English studies. When in England there was a fight for and against English as a proper subject. Professors of Oxford and Cambridge universities, they were not willing to accept English as a proper subject. Okay. Then after that, there was a report which was presented by Robert, and that report is known as Newbold Report. In this report, it was said that in order to bring stability in the English society, they just wanted to introduce English literature, because literature that could inculcate the feeling of attachment with a country which has its own geographical boundaries. So even if a person who is not bestowed with the resources which are actually given to and which are actually in the control of the elite class, so if the poor class that is not bestowed with those resources and with those blessings, at least those poor people, they could feel pride in being citizens of that country. And it was possible through the teaching of English literature. So in order to bring stability in the English society, this English literature was introduced. Then after that, London University that accepted English as a subject, and it was in 1894 that English was accepted in Oxford University. In 1894, English was accepted as a proper course, while in Cambridge University, it was accepted in 1911. So this journey of English as a proper subject, it was completed, and this course was accepted as a proper course in the universities. But before that, English had no such position in the chapels or in the various colleges which were affiliated with the Cambridge and Oxford universities. Okay, this was the story of Oxford. Now in Cambridge, what we see, there was a group of people, for example, I.A. Richards, uh, William Empson, and F.R. Leavies. This was a group of the writers and the critics, and they also introduced uh, English, and they supported it, and they played their own role in accepting and developing English. Again, let me tell you that till this stage, English literature was connected with English language. Many people like Professor of History Edward Freeman, they were not willing to separate literature from language. Now, this group of I.A. Richards, William Empson, and F.R. Leavies, these were the people who separated literature from language or from linguistic investigation. For example, I.A. Richard, who was the founder of a method that was called practical criticism, and this was also the title of his book, which was published in 1929. Now, he was the one I. Richards, he was the one who isolated the text from the history and context. And this approach is called decontextualized approach to literature. Let me explain this decontextualized approach to literature. You have already studied it in the subject of criticism. In order to criticize or in order to develop a proper criticism of Shakespearean plays, you had to put that play, for example, Macbeth or Othello or Julius Caesar, you had to put that in a proper context. And what is meant by that context? By that context, we mean linking that play with the author. For example, William Shakespeare. You had to know about William Shakespeare. You had to know about the political context of the play, especially of the historical plays. But it is not restricted just to the historical plays. Every play, according to the contextualized approach, you needed to put that in a proper context. And for that context, you need to know about the writer, you need to know about his or her life, you needed to know about the political, social, and economic situation. For example, in case of John Milton, we need to know about the Puritan age, and we need to know about that religious environment. We need to know about the fight between Protestants and the Roman Catholics, the way the Protestants, they reacted against the Roman Catholics and the Reformation movement that came into existence. So you need to have a proper understanding of all those contexts. That is called a contextualized approach to literature. Now, in case of I.A. Richards, we do not see any context. Rather, we need to detach context from the literature. We need to detach poem from the literature. So this approach is called decontextualized approach. I.A. Richards, he was of the view that a critic or a reader needed to focus on just words on the page. Words are enough in order to appreciate that literary text, especially the poetry. Context were not needed. So that was his approach, which is called practical criticism. Now, advantage of this approach of practical criticism, I.A. Richards, it was that at least he separated literature from the language or from linguistic investigation. Secondly, the next person, that was William Empson, and who wrote about the ambiguity of language. By this ambiguity of language, I do not mean the ambiguity in the sense of Jacques Derrida. By this ambiguity, William Empson meant verbal ambiguity, the way we find this ambiguity in the case of, for example, a metaphor. When we say that he is a lion, when we compare that person, one person with a lion, with an animal, and out of that comparison, we refer to quality, for example, the quality of bravery, or we say that he is lying on the grass. That is a simple sentence in which we try to focus on the verb lying or on the verb bravery or on so many other words. So words, they do not give us a clear or just one meaning. There are many meanings which we can link, and exactly the same thing that was discussed in case of Derrida, who was of the view that one word that leads to another word, the signifier and signified, in order to know about the meaning of that word, we need to link it. For example, in order to know about the meaning of man, we need to link it with woman. In order to know about the meaning of colonizer, we need to link it with the colonized. So William Emerson, he thought that language, it is not fixed and meanings are not restricted. Rather, there are many meanings which a word can give us, and that word is called ambiguous, or we call it ambiguity. So but this critical approach of William Emerson, it was too much mechanical, it was too much technical. For example, T.S. Eliot, he said that it was a lemon squeezer school of criticism. William Emerson, he focused on the words in such a technical way that it doesn't seem to be criticism. Rather, it seems to be a very, you can say, criticism, a school of criticism which is too much restricted. We need only to focus on the words, and we need to look at the various meanings of the words. So this is not the job of criticism. The job of criticism is something more, and that is to create new meanings. The last person, who was F.R. Leavies, and the most influential person in the 20th century British criticism, uh, his contribution was that he also focused on close reading, this method of close reading. And his main contribution was that he went beyond poetry. He included novel and some other material. This was the main contribution of F.R. Leavies. And he also thought that only words on the page, they are enough. But the only contribution that he made, that was to enlarge the area of criticism. The area of criticism that is not necessarily, and that was not necessarily to be restricted to poetry. Rather, some other genres could also be included. For example, he included novel. Now, when we look at this whole background, so this English literature, it was detached. It seemed that it was detached from the language studies. It was detached from historical considerations, and it was detached from philosophical questions. And this whole approach of close reading method or practical criticism, it was based on complete isolation of the text. Complete isolation of the text. This was the main objective of criticism, and this we find till this last man, F.R. Leavies. But in the modern literary approaches, we do not find this picture. Rather, we find just the opposite of this whole scenario. For example, from 1930s till 1960s, this practical criticism, it prevailed, and the text that was studied in the form of isolation, there was no need to link it with the various structures or with the various contexts. But after 1960s, we find a kind of criticism which links a text with the historical context, with the philosophical context, or with the linguistic context. So, and this was the point which I wanted to clarify, that why this rise of English literature, it is important in order to link it with the modern literary theories. Because liberal humanism, after this we will talk about liberal humanism, which mainly focuses on words on the page. This we do not see in the other critical approaches, whether it is feminist criticism, or it is post-colonial criticism, or it is Marxist criticism, or it is feminism or feminist criticism, or it is narratology, or it is or narratological approaches, or it is culture and materialism, or it is new historicism. We do not see this kind of approach or close reading method or practical criticism in those approaches. If you have any question, you can ask till this point. Do you have any question?
No, sir.
No, sir. Assalamu alaikum, sir. Sir, for next lecture, can you allow us to record your session, please?
I'm just recording my own lecture, and hopefully you will get this recorded lecture.
From where, sir?
I will share it with the coordinator, Amir Saab, and he will share it with you.
All right, sir. Thank you.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
I have a question, sir.
Yes.
Sir, there are approaches in literary criticism towards studying a text. Different approaches are there, such as mimetic approach, expressive approach, pragmatic approach, and objective approach. So where does it fall now?
Okay.
The practical criticism.
Whether it is practical criticism, or it is a liberal humanism or liberalist approach, or it is structuralism, post-structuralism, or various models and theories based on structuralism or post-structuralism. Whatever you talk about, there are just two views. One is objectivity, and the next one is subjectivity. You call some approaches as objective or some approaches as subjective. But it is
Yes, sir.
open to interpretation and open to the views. For example, traditionally, when the status of, for example, the status of woman that was seen, so it was felt in the modern literary theories that that was highly subjective, because women that was marginalized intentionally, are the status of poor class, that was highly subjective, because working class that was marginalized, though the working class that had and that still has its own contribution in the development of economy. So after that, uh, uh, that subjective approach that was challenged, and it was challenged with the help of various points. The main point of inspiration for all these traditional approaches, that was language, which we would study in the form of structuralism. I will explain it with the views of Ferdinand de Saussure. That would be my next topic. So you can call that traditional approach as subjective, and these modern approaches as objective. But it doesn't mean that modern approaches, they are purely objective. Even these modern approaches, they are also subjective, and we will discuss that how they are objective. For example, just one example, that is, if you have heard about binary opposites. If you have heard about
Yes, sir.
binary opposites in case of structuralism, which was restricted just to two concepts, and that was, for example, day and night, men and women, colonizer and colonized. Now, this relationship was
Zero
restricted
and one.
just to two values. One was positive value, and the other one was negative value. Day is positive, night is negative. Man is positive, woman is negative. Colonizer is positive, and colonized is negative. White is positive, and black is negative. Okay.
Negative.
So that was a modern approach, but even this modern approach, this was highly subjective, because it was challenged in the form of post-structuralism, especially by Jacques Derrida. And he said that there is no positivity and no negativity here, because the meaning of day, it lies only in the meaning of night. The importance of man, that lies in the existence of woman. The existence of white, that can be clarified only with the help of black. If there had been no black, so white, that would not have been possible to exist. If there had been no woman, so man would not have been
Yes, sir.
in the form of this existence. So that was challenged later on by Jacques Derrida in the form of post-structuralism. So even modern approaches, we cannot say that they are highly objective. This question of subjectivity and objectivity, it continues.
It continues, yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, let me know about your response. Like this is my first time, I had no class with you in the first semester, so I don't know whether you just go ahead with me or there is any problem. If there's any problem, then you can share it with me.
No problem, sir.
There is no problem.
No problem.
Okay, then
No, sir, no problem, no
okay,
issue.
then for 10 to 15 minutes, I just continue my lecture and I move ahead.
Yes, sir.
Okay, now we come to the liberal humanism, and this was the approach for which I just tried to explain the rise of English literature or the background of English literature. Let me tell you that this rise of English literature, I just took help from the book of Peter Berry, Beginning Theory. And there is another book, Introduction to English Literature, which is written by Terry Galton. The book of Terry Galton, that is comparatively difficult to understand, but the book of Peter Berry and the book of Hans Burton, these two books, these are easy to understand. So I have prepared this lecture from three books, the book of Peter Berry, Hans Burton, and the third one, the Introduction to English Literature, that is by Terry Galton. Okay, now coming to liberal humanism. Liberal humanism assumes that all of us are essentially free and that we have, at least to some extent, created ourselves on the basis of our individual experiences. This approach, it depends on this belief that human beings, they are completely free. Whatever we do, we are responsible for that. Whatever happens to us, we are responsible for that. Only in that case, because the main essence of liberal humanism is continuity, something which remains fixed and something which remains the same for all the time, for all the people. If we link this belief with literature, for example, that there is a literature which is universal, there is a literature which remains the same and which does not change. So it means that we have to develop our belief in the fixed entity of whether literature or culture or education or anything else. So this liberal humanism, it also rests on the main essence of fixity, universality, something which does not change. And the most important figure in this case is Matthew Arnold, whose belief in universal culture, that is quite prominent, who had developed his belief in the best, especially in culture, which has been taught and said. So liberal humanism further, it says that good literature is of timeless significance. It is universal. Such writing is not for an age, but for all the time, especially in the words of Ben Jonson, who said about Shakespeare, and especially in the words of Ezra Pound, that it is news which stays news. Okay, let me ask you a question. If literature that is the same and it does not change, it also means that same things are repeated in literature or through literature. Things do not change. Something which was discussed in the Greek plays, in the plays of Greeks, Greek writers, that has been repeatedly discussed in the various ages, and even in this present scenario, the same things are repeated. Then how do we find that aesthetic pleasure in the things which are repeated so many times and which have been repeated so many times? Can you answer this question?
Sir, due to the universality of the,
Yes.
for example,
Yes.
Yes, sir, we can.
How do you find this pleasure?
Excuse me, sir, I would like to answer your question.
Okay.
Actually, sir, it's not because of the text or the work that has been written. It is because of our interpretation, the view, the theory that we apply to it, the lens that we want to see it with. So the pleasure lies in that lens, not in the. I guess it's not because of the same thing that has been repeated again and again. It is because of us that we are interpreting it that way. That's why we find it different and delightful.
But those people who have not interpreted a text and they just read, for example, a novel, a poem, a play, without having any idea of criticism and literary theory, they are, for example, reading a play or a novel or a poem, and they are enjoying it. They enjoyed, for example, the people enjoyed, readers enjoyed in the Greek time, and they enjoyed in the ages which were followed by the Greek time, and they are enjoying even now.
Sir, if
So
a
it's
piece
not
of
possible that. Okay.
Sir,
Sorry.
I would like to
Sir,
Okay, yes.
share
can I
something
answer
with
the
you.
question?
Okay, yes.
Sir, actually, literature proves into human nature. And we, from the Greeks till now, all the human beings are experiencing their lives, but the material commodity gets changed. But the perspective from which they see the world, like emotions and feelings, they are the same. It is beyond the racial or ethnic identity or the social identification of values. All those things which are there in literature, they are common to all people beyond the boundaries of time as well as of place. So we find a pleasure in all kinds of literature.
Yes,
Sir,
sir,
may
it is
I add something?
relatable for all sorts
Sir,
of human beings. That's why.
yes.
One by one, okay.
Sir,
Sir, if a
may I add
literature
something?
reflects the universal themes, for example, emotions, feelings, love, hate, so we even people from every age, from every century, they experience these things. So if a piece of literature has these qualities, definitely every person would enjoy it and would find aesthetic pleasure.
Sir, for
Sir, may
example,
I?
Shakespeare. For
Yes.
example, Shakespeare work is universal for everybody, and people from common walks of life, they can easily relate themselves with the stories of Shakespeare, and they can identify their problem and experiences with the stories of Shakespeare.
Okay, you mean to say that when we associate ourselves with the characters, in case of tragedy, we associate ourselves with the tragic heroes and we develop our sympathy with that character. In case of a villain, we try to detach ourselves from that villain. We don't want to be just like that villain. Okay,
Yes,
so we
sir.
see
And
pleasure.
sometimes we try to relate ourselves with the heroine or heroes of the
Yes.
story.
So
Okay.
it's because of the feelings of pity and fear. We have pity on the part of the character, and we have fear on the part of ourselves, that we fear it for ourselves. So for example, if the same things are going to happen to us, so what will we do? So that's because of the idea of relativity, that we can relate to the different characters and the situations which are going on in the drama or in the tragedy. So that's which a kind of, in a way, it just evokes and provokes the feelings of delight in us.
Okay. Okay.
Sir, sir,
Yes.
I want to add something, sir. Aesthetic judgment, sir. Aesthetic judgment of beauty and beautiful object has nothing to do with
While
the object.
yes, while answering the question, while answering my question, the other participants, they should mute their mic. Yes.
Yes, sir. Sir, aesthetic judgment of the beautiful object or the beauty has nothing to do with the object in itself, but by the perception that the subject perceives it, sir. So it means that, sir, perception are different, time is different, time changes, so perception changes, experiences are different. So in ancient time, a person might have enjoyed a tragedy, but in the modern age, he might not enjoy it like that. So it means that it changes, sir. Perception changes, beauty doesn't change. Beauty is there, beauty is constant.
You are right when you said that this perception changes. For this perception, we actually have a proper word, and that is literariness. The standard of
Aesthetic
literariness,
sense.
it changes from time to time. For example, there were
Yes,
many
sir.
literary figures. For example, John Donne, he was not accepted as a
Yes, sir.
poet during his life, but later on, he was accepted as a poet. So it means that when you write, or when a writer writes in a particular age, if he or she doesn't follow that literariness, he or she is not accepted, and his views are not accepted. So my point is that the idea of literariness that changes from time to time. We will discuss in detail. My comment was, and I wanted to have comment on this quoted sentence, that it's news which remains or which stays news. This is the view of Ezra Pound about literature, that literature is not something which is based on innovation. Literature is not about innovation, rather literature is about repetition. Things are being repeated. The question is that how can we seek pleasure from something which is repeated so many times since the Greek masters? We will discuss it in great detail in the case of formalism, and then I will talk about, for example, the technique of defamiliarization. Familiarization means something with which you are very familiar. Uh, that something familiar that doesn't give you any innovation. But when you make it strange, that strangeness gives you some pleasure, and you take interest in that familiar object just because of that strangeness. And in the same way, this technique was, and this we will discuss with reference to poetry. In case of prose, in case of novel, we will discuss, for example, the technique of fabula and sujet, that how we seek pleasure in the tales which are repeated so many times, and which have got the same backbone. So that we'll discuss later on in case of formalism, that how we can seek pleasure from literature. Though there are
Yes,
many
sir.
texts which are about, for example, love, which are about ambition, which are about jealousy, but on the same subjects, on the same themes, we read different plays, different novels, and we seek
Class,
pleasure. Okay. A timeless culture must be the creation of timeless minds, that is, of minds that can at least temporarily disregard the world around them. Liberal humanism, it is of the view that there are certain minds which are timeless. Those minds are those writers. They are not restricted just to a specific country or to specific geographical boundaries. Rather, they are acceptable for all the people, and they're acceptable for all the geographical boundaries. They are the ones who are supreme uh, in the circle of the writers. Now, this was accepted, but this belief, it was actually based on certain political motives. And it was the time when the British colonizers, they were ruling over the Indian subcontinent, and they were on the one hand fighting with the people of their own country. They had to convince them, and they had to give them a sort of satisfaction that if, for example, there was a sort of there was sort of inequality, so they had to pacify their own people, that they could feel pride in being part of a country which was which was sort of powerful state, and which was ruling over almost 85% of the world. So on the one hand, they were fighting with their own people, but on the other hand, they were also fighting with the external world. By the external world, I mean those colonies which they had brought under their own control. So they needed to universalize their values. They needed to universalize their literature. They needed to universalize their political system in the form of democracy. They needed to universalize their literature in the form of English literature. Because you know that it is quite difficult to maintain power with the help of physical force, by sending their army, or by using violence. This is quite difficult, but it becomes very easy once you colonize the minds of those people. So by universalizing literature, I'm talking about literature because this is the point of our concern. So by universalizing literature, they could easily impose their own literature. And as I have already said, that literature is the most effective substitute for religion. They wanted to universalize their own literature. For example, if they could boost up, for example, James Joyce, If they could boast of Shakespeare, if they could boast of Milton, why not of, for example, the Russian writers? Russian writers, they were not acceptable. And there are so many approaches which were actually introduced by the Russian writers. For example, this Russian formalism, it was introduced by the Russian writers. And for example, there are so many other approaches which were introduced by the Russian writers, and they were
Yes.
they were accepted in the case of English society, in the case of American society. But even then, Russian writers, they were not propagated and they were not given that much projection. So it means that it was based on political motives. Now, this point of timeless culture, when liberal humanism that develops its belief in timeless culture and timeless literature, so it was also based on political motive. They wanted to universalize their culture and they wanted to universalize their literature. Let me link this timeless culture with the views of Matthew Arnold, who said that the culture which has been taught, the best culture which has been taught and said in the world. Now, if we take this culture, which culture he referred to, for example, the culture which was inspired with a particular education. Now, when we link culture with a particular education, then what kind of education, whether it was the education of English society or it was the education of the Indian society? Because you know that when the British colonizers, they came and they very slowly and tactfully, they made a division between the Oriental schools and the English schools. And then later on, this division was it was removed, and there was only the British system of education which was dominated and which prevailed, and it prevails even now. And again, I would recommend you to read that essay of Gauri Vishwanathan, which is about the introduction of English literature in the Indian subcontinent, which touches the religious aspect of the literature, that through literature, Christianity or the values, religious values were propagated. So by timeless culture, they actually meant English culture. And by timeless literature, they meant English literature. But anyhow, this we have to focus on liberal humanism, that liberal humanism has a belief in timeless culture and timeless minds. The literary text contains its own meaning within itself. uh, it doesn't require any elaborate process of placing it within a text. Now, the political motive behind this belief was, if you put a text within a context, within a proper context, then you have to put, for example, the writings of Leo Tolstoy, you have to put his novels within Russian context. You have to put the writing of, for example, Shakespeare within English context. You have to put the writings of James Joyce within English society or within English culture. Then there would be a division. So English culture, that would not seem to be giving any inspiration to other cultures or to other societies or to other minds. Then there would be a break or demarcation between various cultures and various communities. So in order to erase those demarcations and those differences, they just inculcated this claim of universal text and universal literature. All these are likely to interfere fatally with what the 19th century critic Matthew Arnold said was the true business of criticism: to see the object as in itself it really is. Matthew Arnold, he was of the view that the objective, the main motive of criticism is just to analyze the object, just to focus on the object, not to link that object with the other objects. But this was the belief of liberal humanism. In the literary approaches, we will not see and we will not find this approach. Rather, in critical approaches, we have to link one object with the other object, one idea with the other idea, and one literature with the other literature. You can have a clear understanding of this universal literature if you read the background of comparative literature. There's a book of Susan Bassnett, which is about the introduction of comparative literature. If you read that, that will tell you the way comparative literature, it came into existence and what was meant by comparative literature, which was actually based on the belief that English literature, it would accommodate the other literatures, for example, African literature, Indian literature, Russian literature, and so many other literatures. But later on, the standard, when there was a question of the standard, that what would be the standard for all the literatures. When we talk about Indian, Arabic, Russian, English literatures, and so many other literatures, then what would be the standard? So it was then later on said, and it was established as a fact, that English would be taken as a standard, and the other literatures, they had to be evaluated with the yardstick of English literature, which simply meant that the other literatures, they were in the periphery, and English literature, that was in the center. Anyhow, we move on to the next slide. Both form and content in literature are important, and both must be fused in an organic way. There are two approaches. One approach that has its belief in the form, that form is important, and the other approach that has its belief in the content. In case of practical criticism, content, the belief in content, that is more important, that only the content is important, only words on the page are important, and only words on the page that can give us complete meaning. So it means that the content is self-sufficient. But the belief in form, which is actually formalism, it says that form that gives us meaning. But anyhow, there is also an approach which says that form and content, they must be fused together. They must be linked with each other in such a way that one cannot be detached from the other. What critics do is to interpret the text based largely on words on the page so that the reader can get more out of reading the text. This criticism, it is for the sake of giving new meaning, the meanings even that the writers, they were not aware of. It is not necessary that when Shakespeare, he wrote the play, The Tempest, so he was aware of, for example, the master and the slave, that he belonged to the class of the master, the colonizer, and that the rest, they belong to the class of the colonized. So sometimes it might be an unconscious effort, sometimes it might be a conscious effort. For example, in case of Rudyard Kipling, this was a conscious effort that he wrote. For example, Kim, he wrote the Overland Mail. So that was a conscious effort because he spent most of his time in the United India. So it might be a conscious effort, it might be an unconscious effort. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. If you have any question, you can ask, and then I would conclude my session. Yes, is there any question?
No, sir, it's clear, sir. Sir, can we get the recorded lecture from anywhere?
I have already told you that I would send the recorded lecture to the coordinator, Amir Saab, and then you can contact him. Rather, he will share that recorded lecture with you.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you, sir.
If there's no question, then I would conclude my lecture.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.